Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating paradigm shift when it comes to leadership and organizational growth. It's a strategy pulled straight from one of the most famous ancient texts in history, the parable of the sower. And honestly, whether you're leading a small community group, a massive congregation, or you're just studying movement dynamics, how you invest your time and energy literally dictates your ultimate impact. The source material we're unpacking today proposes a pretty radical shift. It moves away from just trying to gather the absolute biggest crowd possible and instead leans into a highly targeted, multiplier-based strategy. We're going to look at why just having the right message is really only half the battle, and why finding what's called the good ground changes absolutely everything. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with understanding the four grounds. Then we'll look at the ministry multiplication problem, how to find the person of peace, changing your church's message, and finally, shifting focus for lasting fruit. All right, part one, understanding the four grounds and the parable of the sower framework. So our source anchors this entire strategy right in Mark chapter 4, and it emphasizes that this specific parable isn't just, a nice story. It is the absolute foundational key to understanding how the kingdom actually works. Without grasping this, the philosophy argues you're really going to struggle to understand any of the other leadership parables Jesus taught. The core idea here is incredibly practical. Just having the right seed, which represents the gospel or your core message, isn't enough on its own. It's a huge misconception that a great message automatically guarantees great results. But the framework points out that even the most perfect seed must be sown correctly. And more importantly, it has to land in the correct environment to actually take root and survive. Now look at how this breaks down into four specific environments or grounds. First up is the path. The obstacle here is immediate. The word is stolen before it even does anything. Then you've got the rocky ground. Here, the seed is actually received with a ton of immediate joy. But the second persecution or hardship hits, it falls away, simply because there are no roots. Third is the thorny ground. The seed grows a little bit, but it quickly gets choked out by the worries of life and the deceitfulness of riches. Now pay close attention here, because this is crucial. Those first three grounds ultimately fail to produce any lasting result. You put in the work, you cast the seed, but the outcome is zero. The real target is exclusively the fourth environment, the good ground. Here, there are no structural obstacles. The person hears the message, accepts it deeply, and then they multiply it. And this is where the math gets absolutely wild. When that seed hits the good ground, the return on your investment isn't just a 1-to-1 ratio. It produces 30, 60, or even 100 times what was originally sown. We aren't talking about basic addition anymore. We're talking about exponential multiplication. The source notes that in any kind of outreach, you're always going to encounter all four grounds. That's just a given. So the strategy here advises leaders not to get discouraged when you hit grounds 1, 2, or 3. The real secret is learning to quickly recognize those dead ends so you can save your heavy investment for the ground that's actually going to yield that 100-fold return. Moving on to part 2, the ministry multiplication problem and the tension between hard work and lasting fruit. So many leaders today are just completely burning out, and the source points to a really stark contrast in strategies as the main culprit. For most organizations, the default is the crowd gathering strategy, basically making the barrier to entry as low as humanly possible. But the source critiques this, pointing out that this method just fills your room with rocky and thorny grounds. These are people who, they like the show, but they won't actually do the work. Contrast that with the disciple multiplying strategy. This was the model Jesus actually used. Instead of trying to manage thousands of superficial, shallow relationships, the focus is heavily invested in a very small, select group, literally just 12 people. By building deep, robust roots in a few, you create a genuinely scalable movement, not just a weekly event. And this brings us to the real pain points of the modern multiplication problem. So many organizations today are packed to the brim with ground 2 and 3 attendees. And because the room is full, it creates this really powerful illusion of success. Right? The seats are packed, the lights are on, but when you look under the hood, it yields almost zero lasting fruit. Because of this, leaders are pushing themselves to the absolute brink, experiencing massive burnout, despite putting in all this incredible effort. Why? Well, the core issue is that they're wasting premium seed, their time, their energy, their limited resources on fundamentally unproductive ground. It's like trying to force a harvest where the soil just won't support it. Which brings us to section 3, finding the person of peace. Identifying the prepared heart. So if wasting seed on bad ground is the problem, how do we actually spot the good ground in real life? The source gives us a very specific term for this individual, the person of peace. This is a concept drawn straight from Luke chapter 10. By definition, a person of peace is someone whose heart has already been opened to receive the word. You aren't having to break down massive walls of hostility or apathy, because that internal preparation has already been done. That makes them the absolute key to multiplication. Shifting your focus here means you stop spending 80% of your time trying to convince resistant people, and instead you actively look for the ones who are naturally leaning in, hungry for the seed you're planting.
To really anchor this, the source brings up a classic historical example, Lydia from Acts 16. The text specifically points out that her heart was opened to pay attention to the message. She wasn't just some passive consumer looking for a quick emotional high like the rocky ground. She had a prepared heart. The second she received the message, she immediately brought her whole household into the fold and opened her home as a base of operations. She multiplied the message instantly. And that right there is the ultimate hallmark of a person of peace. They don't just consume, they immediately partner up and multiply.
Okay, let's look at section 4, changing your church's message and how the seed dictates the harvest. Here's a huge assertion from the source material. Your message is basically a massive filter. The seed dictates the harvest. For instance, if you broadcast a feel-good message, one that promises constant comfort and avoids the hard truths, you will definitely attract a crowd. But that crowd will be entirely made up of grounds 2 and 3. It appeals to surface-level desires, but the minute things get tough, they vanish. On the flip side, the take up your cross message is demanding. It requires actual sacrifice. It naturally repels the rocky and thorny grounds, but it is an absolute magnet for ground 4. It attracts the person of peace who is ready to pay the price, dig deep roots, and bear lasting fruit. Simply put, if you want better ground, you have to change the seed you're throwing. I love how this quote sums up the endgame so perfectly. Paul, writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:2, says, "Find faithful people who can teach others." Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, go find the biggest crowd or try to convince your most stubborn critics. No, he says, find the faithful, the good ground, who actually have the capacity to turn around and teach others. This just goes to show that this isn't some trendy new management fad. It's a foundational, multi-generational strategy that's been used for thousands of years to build massive movements from tiny dedicated origins. Finally, section 5, shifting focus for lasting fruit and executing the strategy. So how do we actually do this? The source gives us a really clear, methodical 4-step roadmap. Step 1, change your message to attract the right people. Upgrade that seed from a crowd-pleasing message to a real disciple-making one. Step 2, actively scan your organization to identify those few good ground individuals, your persons of peace. Step 3 is where the real work happens. You consolidate your efforts and invest intensely into those select few, instead of spreading yourself paper thin trying to reach everyone. And step 4, which is absolutely critical for your sanity as a leader, expect and accept that some people are going to leave. When you stop catering to grounds 2 and 3, they will naturally filter themselves out. That fallout, it isn't a failure. It's a totally expected and necessary part of the process. To make this transition as smooth as possible, the source offers some great practical takeaways. First, be totally transparent. Teach the parable of the sower directly to your team or congregation to give them the framework. Then, help them self-identify. Let them honestly assess which ground they currently are. Next, let your good ground people share their testimonies publicly. Let the ones who are multiplying share their stories to inspire and challenge everyone else in the room. The ultimate goal here is pretty profound. The text suggests that by aligning your leadership methods with this focused, ancient model, doing it Jesus' way, you actually yield exponentially more fruit, while doing way less of that exhausting, burnout-inducing work. You're just working smarter, tapping into the natural laws of multiplication. Which leaves us with this final thought to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer. Take a hard look at your calendar. Look at where your energy actually goes every single week. And ask yourself honestly, are you just planting to keep a crowd entertained, or are you strategically planting for a hundredfold harvest? How you answer that question is going to determine the entire future of your leadership. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep